Hi everyone, Joseph here, and today I want to do something a little different. So I know that reading is an archaic pastime that people don't do anymore, but today I wanted to try something a little different, and I figured that maybe we'd read one of the books I've been trying to dig myself into for the past couple days. So what I've got here is my phone with the time, and I think we should just try to read for 10 minutes, and the book that we're going to be reading here is Microbe Hunters by Paul de Cruyff. Um, so just a little bit of background. Paul de Cruyff was a microbiologist. He wrote this book in 1926, and essentially it was a book that basically got a lot of praise and criticism for a whole bunch of different people. And essentially, this book was an inspiration for a lot of the microbiologists of the time, of our time now, and of the generation before. So I think that, it might be fun just to read for a little bit and just see how it goes. Yesterday I read with a friend, and it was a really great experience. My friend Sumaya is thinking of starting a biomedical club, reading books, and I think that that is an awesome, great idea that we don't have enough of today. So without further ado, I'm just going to hop into where I've been reading. This one is on Pasteur. So I guess we'll start the timer now. Here we go. And I've also tried to get rid of the glare, so I turned down my computer screen so that that's not a problem anymore. Okay, so we'll read for maybe like 10 minutes. Pasteur was now presented to Emperor Napoleon III. He told that dreamy gentleman that his whole ambition was to find the microbes that he was sure must be the cause of disease. He was invited to an imperial house party at Compiègne. The guests were commanded to get ready to go hunting, but Pasteur begged to be excused. He had a dray load of apparatus sent up from Paris, though he was only staying at their palace for a week, and he impressed their imperial majesties enormously by bending over his microscope while everybody else was occupied with frivolous and gay amusements. The world must know that microbes have got to have parents. At Paris, he made a popular speech at the scientific soiree at the Sorbonne before Alexandre Dumas, the novelist, and the woman genius George Sand, the princess Mathilde, and 100 more smart people. That night he staged a scientific vaudeville that sent his audience home in awe and worry. He showed them lantern slides of a dozen different kinds of germs. Mysteriously, he darkened the hall and suddenly shot a bright single beam of light through the darkness. Observe the thousands of dancing specks of dust in the path of this ray, he cried. The air of this hall is filled with these specks of dust, these thousands of little nothings that you should not despise always, for sometimes they carry disease and death, the typhus, the cholera, the yellow fever, and many other pestilences. This was dreadful news, his audience shuddered, convinced by his sincerity. Of course, this news was not strictly true, but Pasteur was no mountebank. He believed it himself. Dust and the microbes of the dust had become his life. He was obsessed with dust. At dinner, even at the smartest houses, he would hold his plates and spoon close up to his nose, peer at them, scour them with his napkin. He was with a vengeance putting microbes on the map. Every Frenchman from the emperor down was becoming excited about Pasteur and his microbes. Whisperings of mysterious and marvelous events seeped through the gates of normal school. Students, even professors, passed the laboratory a little tremble with awe. One student might be heard remarking to one another as they passed the high-grade walls of the normal school in Rue d'Ulm. There is a man working here. His name is Pasteur, who is finding out wonderful things about the machinery of life. He knows even about the origin of life. He is even going to find out, perhaps, what causes disease. So Pasteur succeeded in getting another year added to the course of scientific studies. New laboratories began to go up. His students shed tears of emotion at the fiery eloquence of his lectures. He talked about microbes causing disease long before he knew about whether or not they cause disease. He hadn't yet got his fingers at the throats of mysterious plagues and dreadful deaths, but he knew there were other ways to interest the public, to arouse even such a hard-headed person as the average Frenchman. I beg you, he addressed the French people in a passionate pamphlet, take some interest in these sacred dwellings meaningly called laboratories. Ask that they be multiplied and completed. They are the temples of the futures, of riches and comfort. 50 years ahead of his time, as a forward-looking prophet, he held fine austere ideals up to his countrymen while he appealed to their wishes for a somewhat piggish material happiness. A good microbe hunter, he was much more than a mere wool-gathering searcher, much more than a mere man of science. Once more, he started out to show all of France how science could save money for her industry. He packed the boxes of glassware and an eager assistant, Duclos, and bustled off to our boy's old home. Our boy. He hurried off up there to study the diseases of wine to save the imperiled wine industry. He set up his laboratory in what had been an old cafe, and instead of gas burners, he had to be satisfied with an open charcoal brazier that the enthusiastic Duclos kept glowing with a pair of bellows. From time to time, Duclos would scamper across to the town pump for water. Their clumsy apparatus was made by the village carpenter and tinsmith. Pasteur rushed around to his friends of long ago and begged bottles of wine, bitter wine, ropey wine, oily wine. He knew his old researches that it was yeast that changed grape juice into wine. He felt certain that it must be some other wee microscopic being that made wines go bad. And sure enough, when he turned his lens onto those ropey wines, he found them swarming with very tiny, curious microbes, hitched together like strings of beads. He found the bottles of bitter wine, infested with another kind of beast, and the kegs of turned wine by still another. Then he called the wine growers and the merchants of the region together and proceeded to show them magic. Bring me a half a dozen bottles of wine that has gone bad with different sicknesses, he asked them. Do not tell me what is wrong with them, and I will tell you what ails them without tasting them. The wine growers didn't believe him. Among each other they snickered at him as they went to fetch the bottles of sick wine. They laughed at the fantastic machinery in the old cafe. They took Pasteur for some kind of earnest lunatic. They planned to fool him and brought him bottles of perfectly good wine among the sick ones. And then he set about flabbergasting them. Just as an aside, nobody uses the word flabbergast anymore. I think that's actually a tragedy. It's actually hilarious. This was like flabbergasting. With a slender glass tube, he sucked a drop of wine out of a bottle and put it between two little slips of glass before his microscope. The wine raisers nudged each other and winked French winks of humorous common sense, while Pasteur sat hunched over his microscope, and they became more merry as the minutes passed. Suddenly, he looked at them and said, "There is nothing the matter with this wine. Give it to the taster. Let him see if I'm right." The taster did his tasting, then puckered up his purple nose and admitted that Pasteur was correct, and so went through a long row of bottles when Pasteur looked up from his microscopes and prophesied bitter wine turned out to be bitter, and when he foretold the next sample was ropey, the taster acknowledges that ropey was right. The wine raisers mumbled their thanks and lifted their hats to him as they left. "We don't get the way he does, but he's a very clever man, very, very clever," they muttered. That is much for a peasant Frenchman to admit. When they left, Pasteur and Duclos worked triumphantly in their tumble-down laboratory. They tackled the question of how to keep these microbes out of healthy wines. They found at last that if you heat wine just after it is finished fermenting, even if you heat it gently, way below the point of boiling, the microbes that have no business in the wine will be killed, and the wine will not become sick. That little trick is now known to everybody by the name of Pasteurization. Now that people of the east of France had been shown how to keep their wine from going bad, the people of the middle of France clamored for Pasteur to come and save the vinegar-making industry. So he rushed down to Tours. He had got used to looking for microscopic beings and all kinds of things by now. He had no longer groped as he had to do at first. He approached the vinegar kegs where wine was turning itself into vinegar. He saw peculiar-looking scum on the surface of the liquor in the barrels. "That scum has to be there, otherwise we got no vinegar," explained the manufacturers. In a few weeks of swift, sure-fingered investigation that astonished the vinegar makers and the wives, Pasteur found that the scum on the kegs was nothing more nor less than billions upon billions of microscopic creatures. He took out great sheets of the scum and tested it and weighed it and fussed with it, and at last he told an audience of vinegar makers and their wives and their families that the microbes which change wine to vinegar actually eat them up and turn into vinegar 10,000 times their own weight of alcohol in a few days. What gigantic things these infinitely tiny beings can do. Think of a man of 200 pounds chopping 2 millions of pounds of wood in 4 days. It was by some such homely comparison as this one that he made microbes part of these humble people's lives. It was so that he made them respect these miserably small creatures. It was by pondering on their fiendish capacity for work that Pasteur himself got used to the idea that there was nothing so strange about a tiny beast, no larger than the microbe of vinegar, getting into an ox or an elephant or a man and doing him to death. Before he left them, he showed the people of Tours how to cultivate and care for those useful wee creatures that so strongly added oxygen to wine to turn it into vinegar, and millions of francs for them. These successes made Pasteur drunk with confidence in his method of experiment. He began to dream impossibly gaudy dreams of immense discoveries and super Napoleonic microbe huntings, and he did more than brood alone over these dreams. He put them into speeches and preached them. He became, in a word, a new John the Baptist of the religion of the germ theory. But unlike the unlucky Baptist, Pasteur was a forerunner who lived to see at least some of his prophecies come true. Then, for a short time, he worked quietly in his laboratory in Paris. There was nothing for him to save just then, until one day in 1865, fate came to his door and knocked. Fate, in the guise of his old professor, Dumas, called on him and asked him to change from a man of science into a silkworm doctor. What's wrong with the silkworms? I did not know that they ever had the disease. I know nothing at all about silkworms. What's more, I've never seen one, protested Pasteur. The silk country of the south is my native country, answered Damas. I just come back from there. It is terrible. I cannot sleep nights for thinking of it. My poor country, my village of Elias. This country that used to be rich, that used to be gay with mulberry trees, which my people used to call the golden tree. This country is desolate now. The lovely terraces are going to ruin. The people, they are my people, they are starving. Tears were in his voice. Anything but a respecter of persons, Pasteur, who loved and respected himself above all men, had always kept a touching reverence for Dumas. He must help his sad old professor, but how? It is doubtful at this time if Pasteur could have told a silkworm from an angleworm. Indeed, a little later, when he was first given a cocoon to examine, he held it up to his ear, shook it, and cried, "Why, there's something inside of it!" Pasteur hated to go to south to try to find out what ailed silkworm. He knew he risked a horrid failure by going, and he detested failure about everything. But it is one of the charming things about him that in the midst of all his arrogance, his vulgar sureness of himself, he had kept that boyish love and reverence for his old master. So he said to Dumas, "I am in your hands, I am at your disposal. Do with me as you wish, I will go." And so he went. He packed up never complaining Madame Pasteur and the children and a microscope and 3 energetic and worshipping young assistants, and he went into the epidemic that was slaughtering millions of silkworms and ruining the south of France. Knowing less of silkworms and their sicknesses than a babe in swaddled clothes, he arrived in a lace. He got there and he learned that a silkworm spins a cocoon round itself and turns into a chrysalid inside the cocoon. He found out that the chrysalid changes into a moth that climbs out and lays eggs, which hatch out the next spring into new broods of young silkworms. Silkworm growers, disgusted at his great ignorance, told him that the disease which was killing their worms was called pebrine, because the sick worms were covered with little black spots that looked like pepper. Pasteur found out that there were 1,000 or so theories about the sickness, but that the little pepper spots and the curious little globules inside the sick worm, wee globules that you could only see with the microscope, were the only facts that were known about it. Then Pasteur unlimbered his microscope before he had gotten his family settled. He was like one of those trout fishing maniacs who starts to cast without thought of securing his canoe safely on the bank. He unlimbered his microscope, I say, and he began to peer at the inside of silkworms, or sick worms, and particularly at these wee globules. Quickly, he concluded that the globules were a sure sign of the disease. 15 days after he'd come to Elias, he called the agricultural committee together and told them, "At the moment of egg laying, put aside each couple of moths, the father and the mother. Let the mother lay her eggs, then pin the father and mother moths down on a little board, slit open their bellies, and take out a little of the fatty tissue under the skin. Put this under a microscope and look for these tiny globules. If you can't find any, you can be sure the eggs are sound. You can use these eggs for new silkworms in the spring." The committee looked at the Shining Microscope. "We farmers can't run a machine like that," they objected. They were suspicious. They didn't believe in this newfangled machine. And the salesman that was in Pasteur came to the front. "Nonsense," he answered. "There's an 8-year-old girl in my laboratory who handles these microscope easily and is perfectly able to spot these little globules, these corpuscles, and then you grown men tried to tell me you couldn't learn to use a microscope." So he shamed them, and the committee obediently bought microscopes and tried to follow his directions. Then Pasteur started a hectic life. He was everywhere around the tragic silk country, lecturing, asking innumerable questions, teaching the farmers how to use microscopes, rushing back to the laboratory to direct his assistants. He directed them to do complicated experiments that he hadn't time to do or even watch himself. In the evenings, he dictated answers to letters and scientific papers and speeches to Madame Pasteur. The next morning, he was off again to the neighboring towns, cheering up despairing farmers and haranguing them. But the next spring, his bubble burst, alas. Next spring, when it came time for the worms to climb their mulberry twigs to spin their silk cocoons, there was a horrible disaster. His confident prophecy to the farmers did not come true. These honest people glued their eyes to their microscopes to pick out the healthy moth so as to get the healthy eggs, eggs without the evil globules in them. And these supposed healthy eggs hatch worms, sad to tell, who grew miserably, languid worms who would not eat, strange worms who failed to molt, sick worms who shriveled up and died, lazy worms who hung around at the bottom of their twigs, not caring whether there was another silk stocking on the leg of any fine lady in the world. Oh, poor Pasteur. He had been so busy trying to save the silkworm industry that he hadn't taken time to find out what really ailed the silkworms. Glory had seduced him into becoming a mere savior. For a moment, he forgot that truth is a will-o'-the-wisp that can only be caught in the net of glory-scorning patient experiment. Some silkworm raisers laughed despairing laughs at him. Others attacked him bitterly. Dark days were on him. He worked the harder for them, but he couldn't find bottom. He came on broods of silkworms who fairly galloped up the twigs and proceeded to spin elegant cocoons. Then at the microscope he found these beasts swarming with their tiny globules. He discovered other broods that sulked on their branches and melted away with the gassy diarrhea and died miserably, but in those he could find no globules whatsoever. He became completely mixed up. He began to doubt whether the globules had anything to do with the disease. Then to make things worse, mice got into broods of his experimental worms and made cheerful meals on them, and poor Duclos, Maillot, and Grenez had to stay up by turns all night to catch the raiding mice. Next morning, everybody would be just started working on them when black clouds appeared in the west, and all of them, Madame Pasteur and the children bringing up the rear, had to scurry out to cover up the mulberry trees. In the evening, Pasteur had tried to settle back in his armchair to dictate answers to peeved silkworm growers who had lost everything, using his method of sorting eggs. After a series of such weary months, his instinct to do experiments, this instinct, and the goddess of chance came together to save him. He pondered to himself, I've at least managed to scrape together 3 broods of healthy worms. If I feed these worms mulberry leaves, smeared with the discharges of sick worms, will the healthy worms die? He tried it, and the healthy worms died sure enough, but confounded, the experiment was a fizzle again. For instead of getting covered with pepper spots and dying slowly in 25 days or so, as worms always do of pebrine, the worms of his experiment were curled up and passed away in 72 hours. He was discouraged. He stopped his experiments. His faithful assistants worried about him. But why didn't he try the experiments over? At last, Grenez went off to the north to study the silkworms of Valenciennes, and Pasteur, not clearly knowing the reason why, wrote to him and asked him to do that feeding experiment up there. Grenez had some nice brood of healthy worms. Grenez was sure in his own head, no matter what his chief might think, that the wee globules were really living things, parasites, assassins of the silkworm. He took 40 healthy worms and fed them on good mulberry leaves that had never been fed on by sick beasts. These worms proceeded to spin 27 good cocoons, and there were no globules in the moths that came from them. He smeared some other leaves with crushed up sick moths and fed them to some day-old worms, and these worms wasted away to slow death. They became covered with pepper spots, and their bodies swarmed with the subvisible globules. He took some more leaves with crushed up sick moths and fed them to some old worms, which were ready to spin cocoons. The worms lived to spin the cocoons, but the moths that came out of the cocoons were loaded with the globules, and the worms from the eggs came to nothing. Grenez was excited, and he became more excited when still nights at his microscope showed him that the globules increased tremendously as the worms faded to their death. Grenez hurried to Pasteur. It is solved, he cried. The little globules are alive. They are parasites. They are what make the worms sick. It was 6 months before Pasteur was convinced that Grenez was right, but when at last he understood, he swooped back on his work and once more called the committee together. The little corpuscles are not only a sign of disease, they are its cause. The globules are alive, they multiply, they force themselves into every part of the moth's body. Where we made our mistake was to examine only a little part of the moth. We only looked under the skin of the moth's belly. We've got to grind up the whole beast and examine all of it. Then if we do not find the globules, we can safely use the eggs for next year's worms. The committee tried a new scheme and it worked. The next year they had fine worms that gave them splendid yields of silk. Pasteur saw now that the little globule, the cause of the pebrine, came from outside the worm, and it did not rise by itself inside the worm. And he went everywhere, showing the farmers how to keep their healthy worms away from all contact with leaves that sick worms had soiled. Then suddenly he fell a victim of a hemorrhage of the brain. He nearly died, but when he heard that the work of his building a new laboratory stopped, frugally stopped in expectation of his death, he was furious and made up his mind to live. He was paralyzed on one side after that. He never got over it, but he earnestly read Dr. Smiles' book, Self-Help, and vigorously decided to work in spite of his handicap. At a time when he should have stayed in his bed or have gone to the seaside, he staggered to his feet and limped to the train for the south, exclaiming indignantly that it would be criminal not to finish saving the silkworms while so many poor people were starving. All Frenchmen, excepting a few nasty fellows who called it a magnificent gesture, joined in praising him and adoring him. For 6 years, Pasteur struggled with the diseases of silkworms. He had no sooner settled Pebrine than another malady of these unhappy beasts popped up, but he knew his problem, and found the microbe of this new disease much more quickly. Tears of joy were in the voice of old Damas now as he thanked his dear Pasteur, and the mayor of the town of Alais talked enthusiastically of raising a gold statue to the great Pasteur. So that's pretty much it. This is really the kind of stuff that I enjoy reading in my free time. So yeah, that's a little bit of the insight into, I guess, what microbiologists are thinking back in the day. And Pasteur was one of the greats in microbiology. Not a day goes by when you don't hear about pasteurization, or like with Koch, you don't hear about Koch's postulates. So I just really enjoy this book and highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in studying bacteria. So yeah, I really think that reading is a bygone pastime that people neglect to do often these days, because actually reading from paper is a lot faster and, to me, a lot more meaningful than reading articles online, although it's inevitable that we must do that. So I have a couple of research papers to read tonight, but hopefully this will be uploaded by tomorrow morning. And I'm working on upgrading or making the videos a little bit better one by one, so hopefully my glasses aren't, reflecting the bright light off anymore. And I'm working on learning how to use Illustrator to make thumbnails better. So everything in time, and thank you to my first subscriber. Thank you to my first subscriber, and yeah, I challenge you, if you are a person that has reached out to me and said that they wanted to start blogging or YouTubing or whatever it may be, that you do so, or you try, because feel free to message me and I will set aside the time to help you out. Because I think that being able to help one person or multiple people is really just a great use of my time. And it's really just, a great experience for the both of us. So, to all of you, it is 11:47 here. It's been a long day of studying. But wherever you're at, I hope that you have a fantastic and wonderful day. So I'll see you later, and have fun reading. Bye-bye.